A letter sealed in royal wax, 2 signatures that rewrote everything, and one name Camilla's deliberately crossed out. What could have prompted such a shocking move against the Queen Consort? The air in Windsor had been deceptively still when the protocol letter arrived, but the contents inside tore through the palace like a thunderclap. Within minutes, aides were seen rushing from room to room, clutching copies of the document as whispers spread like wildfire. Camilla's name wasn't just missing, it had been purposefully struck out. This wasn't a printing oversight or a clerical error, this was deliberate. And worse, it had come with the full authority of 2 senior royals, Princess Catherine and Prince Edward. The timing could not have been more jarring. A major ceremonial event honoring the late Queen's legacy was set to commence within hours, and now, an administrative document, one that was typically routine and unremarkable, had detonated a silent bomb within the very foundation of the monarchy. As royal staff stared in disbelief, the question echoed louder than ever. How had this happened under the radar? A coordinated maneuver like this didn't occur overnight. Catherine and Edward had long been known for their quiet dignity, their steadfast loyalty to Queen Elizabeth's traditions. But this was a break from tradition, a subtle, surgical rejection of the very woman who had once been elevated to the highest royal female title. Camilla, Queen Consort, stripped from ceremonial protocol without a public word of explanation. And that's when the real panic began. Senior aides, who had previously operated under the assumption that Camilla's role was unshakable, now faced a chilling possibility. The rules of engagement within the royal family were shifting and fast. For the first time, Catherine wasn't just a beloved figure to the public, she had become an architect of change within the palace walls. And standing beside her, in an alliance few could have predicted, was Prince Edward, often overlooked, yet now holding the pen that may have redrawn the royal order. The corridors buzzed with half-truths and incomplete theories. Some claimed this was payback for a private slight. Others whispered it was rooted in something far deeper, an old wound, a betrayal never fully healed, a vision of the monarchy that Camilla had deviated from. Regardless of the speculation, one fact remained uncontested. Camilla was blindsided. Her reaction, as sources would later reveal, was nothing short of disbelief laced with betrayal. To be erased, and so publicly, without confrontation or warning, was more damaging than any headline or scandal could ever be. It wasn't just her name that had been crossed out. It was her place in the new royal vision. But to understand the fury ignited in that moment, we must go back to the secrets buried beneath years of quiet resentment and private betrayal. She had waited decades for a crown that many believed she should never wear. Camilla's path to royalty wasn't built on public adoration or legacy bloodlines. It was forged in quiet corners, through backroom conversations, and over the ashes of scandal. When she finally became Queen Consort, it wasn't just a personal triumph. It was, in her eyes, a validation. The public had accepted her, the monarchy had embraced her, and her place beside Charles was no longer questioned, at least not publicly. But behind the palace walls, a different story simmered. One not of acceptance, but of quiet resistance. From the earliest days of Charles and Camilla's union, Catherine had sensed something unsettling. It wasn't jealousy or rivalry, it was instinct. Camilla carried herself not just with authority, but with an undercurrent of control, subtle but unyielding. Catherine, raised with a deep respect for duty and royal protocol, noticed early how Camilla's influence over Charles began bending traditions that had remained untouched for generations. Rules were tweaked, responsibilities reassigned, even ceremonial customs were reworded, allegedly to modernize the monarchy, but in truth, many believed it was to carve out a role for Camilla that had never truly existed before. Catherine voiced her concerns privately, cautiously, but it was Edward, the ever-diplomatic youngest son of Queen Elizabeth, who echoed them with quiet but firm disapproval. He had long held the belief that the monarchy's future should be rooted in blood, those born into its lineage, not married into it for redemption. To Edward, Camilla's rise represented not just a reshuffling of tradition but a betrayal of the Queen's long-standing vision for the monarchy's continuity. Yet for years, he remained silent publicly, honoring the hierarchy, even as Camilla's presence grew louder within the institution. As time passed, reports began surfacing Camilla had allegedly begun rewriting internal royal protocol, ensuring she would appear beside Charles in all future state events, as co-sovereign in ceremonial language. Behind closed doors, staff members quietly whispered that references to Queen Consort duties were being phrased in a way that placed her role closer to that of a reigning monarch, a position no one outside the bloodline had ever held. It wasn't just symbolic power she was after, it was structural permanence. This silent tug-of-war sparked subtle but unmissable tensions during royal gatherings. Family dinners grew colder. Conversations between Catherine and Camilla were marked not by warmth but by strategic courtesy. Glances held too long, polite smiles that didn't reach the eyes, long pauses where once there was harmony. Every move Camilla made, every seat she claimed beside Charles, every document she signed seemed to press against Catherine's understanding of what the monarchy should be. And as for Edward, his quiet watchfulness turned into long walks alone on the palace grounds, where staff noticed him visibly uneasy. Catherine's popularity continued to soar with the public, and she never used that influence to wage a direct confrontation. But within, the unease grew. She was beloved not just because she was royal, but because she embodied a sense of duty, humility, and legacy that many believed Camilla could never replicate. And yet, Camilla's grasp on protocol tightened. She operated as though her future as co-ruler was secure, as if the monarchy had no choice but to accept her role at the center of its future. But the monarchy is rarely changed in a single moment. It's shifted through small, deliberate steps. And while Camilla believed her hold over the monarchy was unshakable, one overlooked conversation between Edward and Catherine would unravel everything she thought she secured. It was a chilly evening at Balmoral, the kind of night that whispered old secrets through the walls. In a quiet study tucked away from the ceremonial grandeur of the estate, two figures sat opposite each other, Catherine, poised yet troubled, and Edward, the ever-reserved prince whose silence had long been mistaken for indifference. But this time, silence wouldn't suffice. Not anymore. With the firelight flickering behind him and the weight of history resting heavy on his shoulders, Edward finally spoke not as a brother, not as a spare, but as the guardian of a memory Queen Elizabeth had once entrusted to him in confidence. And what he revealed would change everything. He began carefully, almost reluctantly, confessing that years earlier, the late Queen had shared with him her deep unease about Camilla's growing influence. It wasn't about rivalry or personal bias, Edward insisted. It was about preservation. Queen Elizabeth had spent a lifetime defending the dignity and continuity of the crown, and in Camilla, she had sensed a quiet ambition that, left unchecked, could turn the monarchy from a legacy into a game of power. Her words echoed through Edward's mind even now. The crown is not meant for outsiders to manipulate. It must remain pure not by blood alone, but by intention. For years he'd carried the burden of that warning, too loyal to his brother Charles to speak it aloud, too bound by duty to act against the tide. But something had shifted in Catherine. She didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She listened, her eyes steady, her breath calm. And then she said the one thing Edward never expected to hear. We act not for ourselves, but for what she believed in. It was Catherine's quiet conviction that transformed that evening from a confession into a call to action. She wasn't interested in confrontation or palace theatrics. She understood that the real power of the monarchy had always been in its symbolism, in the protocol that governed not just appearances, but legacy. And if Camilla was attempting to rewrite that legacy in ink, then it was time to meet her on the same battlefield. What followed was a decision as strategic as it was symbolic. Catherine and Edward would draft a formal protocol letter, one that would define ceremonial roles for the coming years, particularly in events where representation of the crown mattered most. It would look ordinary on paper, but the exclusion of Camilla's name would be the statement the monarchy had never dared to make publicly. It wouldn't be a confrontation, it would be a correction. A restoration of Queen Elizabeth's original vision, done not with fury, but with finality. Edward's guilt began to lift as they outlined the plan together. His silence had lasted decades, but it was not in vain. Catherine had become the voice he'd long suppressed, and as they sealed the first draft of the letter that night, neither of them fully grasped the storm it would unleash. Because what began as a whispered alliance was about to explode into the most visible act of rebellion the monarchy had seen in decades. It began with parchment, protocol, and a pen. A routine royal draft meant only to assign ceremonial responsibilities for the upcoming coronation events suddenly morphed into something else entirely. What should have been a simple, administrative formality became a silent rebellion, wrapped in regal paper and signed with unshakable purpose. The letter was never supposed to draw attention. But the moment it arrived on the desk of Windsor's senior aides, it was already vibrating with consequence. Because two names were signed at the bottom, Catherine and Edward, and one name, once written clearly beside Charles, had been crossed out in unmistakable ink: Camilla. At first, the room fell into stunned silence. No one dared question it. No one reached for the phone. Even the most seasoned staff, those who had navigated Diana's heartbreak, Andrew's scandals, and Harry's exodus, stood speechless. Camilla's exclusion wasn't explained in footnotes or softened by vague clauses. It was deliberate, visual, and irreversible. The protocol lawyers, trained to decipher language for loopholes, found none. Edward and Catherine had insisted that every clause uphold Queen Elizabeth's vision. The language was unmistakable. Roles were to be filled only by those whose legacy aligned with the Crown's historic intent. There was no space for ambiguity. No ceremonial seat left vacant for compromise. The decision to remove Camilla's name had not come lightly. Both Edward and Catherine knew what it meant. They were not just altering a document, they were drawing a line in the sand. And once that line was drawn, there would be no returning to the illusion of unity. The monarchy had always relied on the unspoken agreement of silence and survival. But this was the quiet moment it fractured. The moment loyalty to the past finally outweighed tolerance for the present. Their eyes met as the final signature was laid down. There was no celebration, no relief, only resolve. Edward, who had spent years shielding his discomfort behind formality, now stood fully in alignment with the woman the people already saw as queen. And Catherine, with every ounce of grace sharpened by purpose, had chosen not to confront Camilla with words, but to erase her with ink. It was the most royal form of rebellion, subtle, calculated, and devastating. The letter was sent within the hour, hand-delivered to the palace's senior circle, bypassing public advisors and inner aides. It landed on desks like a silent grenade. Some staff stared at it without moving, unsure whether to act or hide it away. Others whispered, wondering if it was even legal. But there it was. Two signatures, both sanctioned by royal birthright, backed by a phrase Queen Elizabeth herself had once used: to serve, not to seize. Whispers turned into panic. Messages were dispatched to private offices. Advisors tried reaching Charles, but it was too late. The machinery had already moved. The protocol had already shifted. And Camilla, still unaware of the letter's delivery, was seated in the drawing room when the news reached her. What happened next would shatter any illusion of royal unity. She held the letter with trembling hands, her eyes darting across the page in disbelief. There it was, her name, once proudly nestled beside Charles's, now replaced by a void, crossed out, not omitted by accident, deliberately and unmistakably defaced by ink. For Camilla, the blow wasn't just administrative, it was symbolic. This wasn't merely a change in protocol. It was a direct assault on everything she had fought to build. And in that devastating instant, the truth crashed down upon her. She had lost the very war she believed was long behind her. The war for recognition. The war for place. The war for power. The room around her fell into a stunned hush. Only moments earlier, she had entered with a sense of confidence, believing the day's agenda was routine, a discussion of ceremonial placement, a glance over upcoming appearances. But then the letter was handed over, and the world shifted. Charles sat motionless beside her, the weight of the moment etched across his face. He didn't speak. He didn't defend. He didn't even reach for her hand. His silence, thick and paralyzing, struck Camilla harder than the ink that had erased her. The man she had supported, stood beside, and reshaped history with, now sat frozen between loyalty and legacy. Her voice cracked as she broke the silence. "They've crossed me out." Literally. It wasn't a question. It was a wound made audible, a gasp for air in a room that had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. But what came next was no longer grief. It was fury. Years of quiet restraint unraveled in minutes. Camilla lashed out, not at the aides, not at the paper, but at Charles. She accused him of weakness, of allowing Catherine to manipulate protocol, of betraying everything they had built together. Her words were sharp, frenzied, a desperate attempt to regain control of something that had already slipped away. And Charles, still stunned, offered no rebuttal, only a haunted gaze that betrayed the realization he could no longer protect her from the shifting tides of royal order. Behind closed doors, the eruption escalated. Camilla demanded answers. She accused Catherine of ambition cloaked in elegance. She called it betrayal dressed in duty. In her eyes, this was no act of preservation. It was a power grab, pure and calculated. But the palace was already moving on without her. Wordlessly, staff began removing ceremonial items prepared for her upcoming appearances, her crest quietly taken down, her seating plan altered, her speeches shelved. There was no formal announcement, no confrontation on record, just a quiet rewriting of roles, as though she had never been written in. And for the first time since stepping into the limelight, Camilla felt not like a queen but like a placeholder who had just been replaced. Her composure shattered. Her voice quivered as she demanded the protocol be reversed, challenged its authority, even threatened to walk. But the walls didn't answer. The crown doesn't pause for pride. It moves forward with the weight of history behind it. But what Camilla didn't know that no one in that room could have possibly imagined was that Catherine had received something else, something older, something final. A second letter, buried deep within the Queen's private archives, and its contents would seal Camilla's fate in a way that no ink ever could. It was the kind of envelope no one expected to see again, crested, wax-sealed, and heavy with the unmistakable gravity of finality. Tucked away within Queen Elizabeth's private archives and marked with chilling specificity, it bore a name that hadn't been uttered in months: the Duchess of Cambridge and the Earl of Wessex. No date, no royal briefing, just a sealed letter buried in a drawer lined with dust and discretion. But when it was finally uncovered, it shifted the weight of the monarchy itself. Inside lay a single handwritten page in the late Queen's delicate but unwavering script. No formal decree, no ornate prose, just clarity, stripped of ceremony. It began with affection addressing Catherine and Edward not just by title, but as guardians of continuity. And then, the words cut through the page like a blade: "The crown must not be used to justify past mistakes." It was not a suggestion, it was a warning, disguised as a farewell. A statement echoing with pain and legacy, written by a monarch who had seen too much sacrificed in the name of image. The message was clear. Queen Elizabeth had never intended for the institution to become a shelter for historical correction. She understood the power of symbolism and the importance of lineage, not simply for blood's sake, but for the people's belief in tradition. And while she had remained publicly composed during Charles's remarriage, her private thoughts painted a very different truth. The letter laid bare her fears. That by allowing Camilla to assume a crown once destined for Diana, the monarchy would sever its emotional connection to the people who had carried it through the darkest decades. She wrote of Catherine as the embodiment of the monarchy's future, not merely for her grace, but for the quiet strength that reminded Elizabeth of herself in her younger years. And she referred to Edward, her ever-loyal son, as the keeper of the crown's memory, someone who understood the silent dignity that duty required. Together, she believed they would know what to do when the time came. She trusted them not with power, but with correction. Catherine read the letter in silence. By the final sentence, her hands trembled. This wasn't just validation, it was instruction. A mandate passed from one queen to another in waiting. According to those close to her, she didn't speak for several minutes. When she finally did, it was through tears. "She never wanted this," she whispered. Not the conflict, not the division, but certainly not the rewriting of history to accommodate a role that had always belonged to someone else. Edward, too, felt the letter like a thunderclap. His guilt for remaining silent all these years had been overwhelming, but now it had transformed into purpose. This wasn't about defiance anymore. This was about carrying out the will of the monarch who had served longer than any before her, and doing so without apology. The letter became the missing piece. The quiet alliance between Catherine and Edward was no longer rooted in instinct or suspicion. It was grounded in royal truth etched in ink by the woman whose word had always been final. Armed with the Queen's blessing, the quiet alliance turned into a declaration of reform, and now, the royal family was fracturing from within. Behind the palace's walls, a quiet war broke out. Father versus son, brother versus brother. And in the shadows of it all stood a queen consort stripped of ceremony, clinging to a crown whose weight had suddenly turned cold. Camilla had been erased not with a speech or a scandal, but with silence, and that silence had fractured the family from within. The moment Charles discovered the protocol letter and the hidden note from the late queen, he didn't hesitate. He summoned William. He expected agreement. He expected loyalty. What he received instead was defiance that cut deeper than any political blow. William didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply said what Charles feared most. "She's preserving what my mother started." There was no ambiguity in his words. William wasn't standing behind Catherine, he was standing beside her, shoulder to shoulder, defending a monarchy shaped by legacy, not revision. Charles, stunned and betrayed, saw his son not as an heir but as a threat, one who had now aligned himself with those quietly rewriting the monarchy's script. But Charles wasn't alone in his disbelief. Camilla, still reeling from the protocol erasure, demanded an audience with Princess Anne, the one royal she had always considered an unpredictable wildcard. And it was Anne, blunt as ever, who gave Camilla the harshest truth yet. "Respect the letter or walk away," she said without hesitation. It wasn't a threat, it was a sentence. The Princess Royal, long known for her loyalty to duty over sentiment, made it clear that the royal bloodline would no longer bend to emotional entitlements or rewritten roles. Camilla's tears didn't sway her. Her legacy speeches fell on deaf ears. The time for negotiation was over. The tension reached its breaking point during a rare private dinner attended by the senior royals. No cameras, no statements, just clenched jaws and bitter silences. Lines were drawn in quiet exchanges, in avoided eye contact, in empty toasts. Edward, though never one to provoke, stood unwavering when Charles accused him of betrayal. "You didn't just cross out a name, you crossed out your brother's trust," Charles snapped. But Edward didn't retreat. He looked Charles in the eye and said, "No, I honored our mother." That single sentence turned the room colder than any frost outside the palace walls. As the divide deepened, Camilla made one final move. She petitioned for a formal royal council, hoping to challenge the protocol letter, reclaim her title's ceremonial relevance, and re-establish her authority. But the request was quietly denied. No council, no appeal. The decision stood, and so did the silence surrounding it. It wasn't just rejection, it was erased with royal consent. Camilla's desperation turned to isolation. Charles's frustration spiraled into quiet bitterness, and the siblings once united by duty were now fragmented by allegiance. But the biggest blow hadn't even arrived yet, because the Church of England had just weighed in, and their verdict would make headlines across the world. When the Archbishop speaks, the monarchy listens. But this time, his words didn't arrive with quiet reflection or soft diplomacy. They crashed into the throne room like a thunderclap. In a carefully worded but unmistakably deliberate statement, the Archbishop of Canterbury issued his verdict on the evolving face of the crown. Without naming a single royal, without uttering a single title, he aligned the Church with what he called the enduring spirit of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II's vision for continuity. And with that one line, the Church of England had spoken loud enough to be heard across every hall of Windsor and every tabloid front page. It was a blow Camilla never saw coming. For weeks, she had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the Church would intervene on her behalf, that her position beside Charles would be sanctified, reinforced by spiritual and historical authority. But instead, the statement gave oxygen to everything she feared. The wording, though shrouded in diplomacy, carried unmistakable intent. Ceremonial roles, it read, must reflect the moral heritage and legacy laid down by Queen Elizabeth II, honoring not just duty, but tradition that lives through the bloodline. That one clause sent royal commentators into a frenzy. Camilla's name wasn't mentioned, but the omission said more than any inclusion ever could. The media exploded. Headlines across the globe framed it with savage clarity. Church sides with Catherine, Camilla silenced by the cloth, monarchy reborn without her. And for once, the palace did not issue denials. No rebuttals, no clarifications, just silence, and silence, in the royal world, means consent. Within 24 hours, Camilla reportedly cancelled all her scheduled appearances. The palace quietly began redirecting ceremonial duties once reserved for the Queen Consort to the Princess of Wales. Seating charts were rewritten. orders of service redrafted. A new portrait schedule was approved, featuring Charles and Catherine without Camilla in frame. Inside the palace, the shift was undeniable. Footsteps grew quieter around Camilla's quarters. Invitations once extended to her were quietly rerouted or rescinded. Staff who had once served under her banner now operated under new instructions. No announcement had been made, yet the changes were everywhere, subtle, strategic, and absolute. This wasn't exile. It was erased, not by scandal or disgrace, but by institutional design. And at its heart stood one truth: the monarchy had chosen not to fight for her. Royal historians began referring to this moment as the final pivot, not just from one queen to another, but from a monarchy of compromise to a monarchy of clarity. One that no longer tiptoed around public sentiment but leaned fully into legacy, symbolism, and bloodline. Catherine, now fully stepping into ceremonial prominence, was no longer just a consort in waiting. She was the embodiment of the monarchy's future, an image of discipline, dignity, and restoration. But even as Camilla vanished from the spotlight, retreating behind palace walls and fractured loyalties, one final act of defiance would ignite her fury. And it came not from Charles, not from Edward, not even from Anne. It came from none other than Prince William himself. At a private family ceremony, far from the cameras, far from the chaos, Prince William made his final move. He stood in silence before the assembled royals, not as a son or a brother, but as the future king. In his hand, he held a small velvet box, aged with time but pristine in meaning. Inside rested a ceremonial brooch, one originally crafted for the Queen Consort, once designated for Camilla. With measured breath and steady voice, William opened the box, turned to Catherine, and pinned it to her dress himself. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The gesture echoed louder than any proclamation. In that moment, before the only people who mattered, he drew the line that would divide the monarchy's past from its future. There was no coronation, there was no throne, no gold, no cathedral. But symbolically, it was everything. William's gesture was a declaration not just of love, but of restoration, of truth, of the monarchy's rightful course, unshackled from compromise and cleansed of silent controversy. The family watched in stillness. Anne's gaze lingered just long enough to show respect. Edward offered the smallest nod. There was no applause, no need. The act had spoken. Catherine now wore not just the brooch, but the weight of a legacy passed from Elizabeth to Diana, and now undeniably to her. Across the palace grounds, Camilla sat watching from her private residence, surrounded not by family but by silence. The footage reached her within minutes. She knew what it meant before the screen even lit up. That brooch was the last thread. The last ceremonial tie connecting her to a crown she had already lost in spirit. Now, even that is gone. The tears didn't fall immediately. They came later, after the final image faded, when the echo of that quiet ceremony left her in a room that no longer needed her presence. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. News outlets flooded with praise for William's grace and Catherine's unwavering strength. Commentators didn't ask who the future queen was anymore, they acknowledged her. Memes turned to messages of support. Headlines crowned Catherine with phrases that hadn't been used since Diana, the people's queen. But this time, there was no tragedy behind the title, only reverence. The world had watched a monarchy correct its course without scandal, without spectacle, just with one name removed and another restored. Within the palace, there was no need for a formal announcement. The shifts had already happened, and the roles had been reclaimed. Charles, though publicly silent, privately accepted the shift he could no longer resist. Anne and Edward, once fragmented by allegiance, now stood side by side, their loyalty realigned around legacy. Camilla, though still titled in name, had become a figure of the past remembered, perhaps, but never again central. And so, a single stroke of a pen crossing out one name ushered in a new era where legacy, not ambition, would define the future of the crown. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.